This lecture is about the cultural politics of work, and it's based on this wonderful book by Kathi Weeks called The Problem with Work. Um, Most of us will spend most of our adult lives working, and our day-to-day lives will be shaped by the needs of our employment, both in terms of our physical health, our mental capacities, and so on. As such, work is or should be central to any attempt to understand contemporary culture. Work is such an accepted part of our lives, we forget to notice all the strange things about it. And Kathy Weeks' work is an excellent exercise in making strange or defamiliarizing work. So I will start there. She says, why do we work so long and so hard? The mystery, she argues, isn't that we are required to work, but that there isn't more resistance to work. And the problems with work are many and obvious. For many, the wages are too low to sustain life. The wage is not a social wage or a living wage. Others are unemployed or underemployed, or just as bad, precariously employed. So we live in an era defined by the need for wage labour, but at the same time, it is an era in which the wage labourer is rapidly losing power. But as Weeks reminds us, even the best job in the world is a problem if it monopolises all of our time. It is not a matter then of considering the practical economic necessity of working, but rather of giving thought to the fact that many of us are willing to live for work. Work defines us, and we give it priority over everything else in our lives, friends, families, loved ones, and so on. We even live apart in order to sustain our jobs. When people ask us about ourselves, we generally start with our jobs, as though that, rather than our personal values, defines us. And why should we give priority to work over, say, our hobbies or our pastimes or the things we believe in? And though work is central to our existence, it figures very little in cultural production. As the cultural historian Michael Denning has remarked, if a Martian viewed all of our films, they conclude we spend more time having sex than actually working. And particularly, this would be true if they got hold of pornography, which makes up about half of all film production. But also think about pop music and literature as well. Their work figures very little. I mean, it is mentioned, of course, but it's only out of proportion to how much time we spend working. And in film, the only occupations that seem to matter are those that involve killing people or chasing people who do kill people. But cultural studies also pays very little attention to work, tending to prefer to focus on cultural commodities such as film and pastimes rather than what we do in the office. Similarly, social theorists tend to focus on questions to do with citizenship and governance rather than the social fact of work. But both cultural studies and social theory tend to take work for granted. But as Weeks points out, we live in a society defined by work. We not only have to work to make a living, we also expect others to work. The expectation that everyone should work is a powerful force in our society, perhaps one of the most powerful political forces from an ideological perspective. Think of the way we treat the unemployed, and in Australia, particularly Indigenous people in remote communities where there is almost no possibility of work. But also think of expectations with respect to pensions. People who work think of themselves as having earned the right to their pension. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, we valorize the rich who we perceive as not having the work. At the level of everyday experience, work is central to our understanding and experience of such things as sites of decision, decision making, relations of power and authority, notions of hierarchy, ideas of obedience, of consent, of duty and obligation, of group membership, of identity, and so on. We see society at large through the lens of our workplace, and most of us really only encounter power directly in the workplace. It is only at work that we get told what we can and cannot do. Now, Weeks suggests there are two reasons why cultural studies has tended to overlook work. The first is that work has become privatized, i.e., rendered non-social. We think of work as a thing private individuals do rather than as a social institution. Thus, as the American sociologist C. Wright Mills argued, we tend to think about work in terms of this or that job rather than as a social fact of work as requirement, work as system, work as a way of life. It is under these conditions that unions have lost their relevance to many people. We are thus more accustomed to thinking of the way a specific employer or boss uses their power rather than paying attention to the system that gives them that power. And in most first world countries around the world, there is extensive legislation in place now to empower the employer and to disempower the employee. So the neoliberal model of government has exacerbated this way of seeing things by promoting an employment model based on individual contracts. It thus makes work a matter of personal choice rather than collective power. Relatedly, and this is the second reason she says cultural studies has neglected work, is the decline of worker activism itself. And work, she says, has been depoliticized. Elections these days tend to hinge on two things: reducing workers' rights in the interests of business and reducing tax on employers, again in the interest of business. If work is mentioned, it is only in the context of creating jobs, not in the context of either improving jobs or eliminating them altogether. This neglect is unjustified, Weeks argues, when you consider that work is the primary means of distributing wealth in our society. It is also the primary source of personal status, and for many people, work is also the primary, if not the only, means of sociality. Not only that, the measure of all education and even parenting is whether or not it prepares one for being employed. Someone is deemed mentally and physically fit when they are fit for work. As Foucault argued in his book on the history of madness, the main reason we lock up the mad and regulate drugs is because madness and certain drugs render people unfit to work. When someone gets out of prison, the key to their readmission to society is their ability to get and hold a job. Because in our society one has to work in order to live, we have come to assume that wage labour is the only means there is for people to meet their needs. And this turns us against welfare models of wealth distribution. So even though wealth is collectively produced, we persist in believing it should be privately or individually distributed. And here I'm quoting Weeks. She says, "Work is the primary means by which individuals are integrated not only into the economic system, but also into social, political, and familial modes of cooperation." End of quote. Work thus produces subjects just as much as it produces goods and services, and this point is absolutely crucial. So work can thus be understood in terms of what Althusser called interpellation. We are recruited and seduced into viewing the world through the privatized lens of work, and we make work the lens by which we understand our relations to the world. To give only one example of this, think of all the ways that gender operates in the workplace. And this isn't just a matter of jobs for the boys and the exclusion of women. It also has to do with the way workers are expected to do gender in the workplace. And again, I'm quoting Weeks. She says, "Gender is put to work whenever work draws upon gendered rules and scripts as a way to negotiate relationships with bosses and co-workers, to personalize impersonal interactions, or to communicate courtesy, care, professionalism, or authority to clients." End of quote. Gender and work identities are coordinated and even co-produced. Think of the strong connection between certain types of blue-collar work and structures of masculinity. Integrating women into blue-collar jobs had to overcome the resistance of threatened masculinity rather than any specific inability of women to perform the roles. So it was more about men not wanting to have women around rather than women not being able to do the job. The satisfaction some people get out of their jobs has more to do with these gender identities than the nature of work itself. By the same token, employers actively recruit, manage, and create gender identities such as the caring nurse, the motherly childcare worker, the sexy barmaid, and so on. The essential question then is how and by what means have we come to desire work? And Weeks' answer to this is that there are two ways to answer it. The first, fairly obviously, is because we must, because of economic necessity. The second one, though, is because we want to. Work provides satisfactions other activities cannot supply. And I would add, it also challenges us to rethink what both desire and satisfaction mean. Deleuze and Guattari make a joke about this in Anti-Oedipus, where they talk about the satisfactions of the handyman. Can you describe hammering a nail into the wall in terms of pleasure? It doesn't seem quite right, and yet there is nevertheless a satisfaction. But she adds, neither explanation is sufficient to explain our lack of protest in the face of the hours we are expected to work and the subjectivities we are expected to adopt and to sustain. The fact there is such a thing as a work ethic suggests very strongly that work is ingrained in our culture very deeply indeed. And as Weber argued, Protestantism attached moral virtue to work. Labouring was thus considered godly, and resistance to work was thus treated as immoral and ungodly. And this outlook shaped the way colonial invaders perceived and treated Indigenous people, who were perceived to be non-working and therefore ungodly, and so on. And if they resisted work, it was because they were heathens and immoral, and hence unfit for the privileges of white society. So it's important to sort of see how the perception of work also structured the way by which the colonial invaders responded to the Indigenous people they encountered. The irony, of course, is that as Weber argued, our attachment to work is irrational. We see it as our calling, as something we are predestined for. The value of work is thus thoroughly naturalized, but work hasn't always been viewed this way. The work ethic, rather than material need, structures the approach people take to work and the expectations that we have of them. We look down on people on low incomes, but we still expect them to take their job seriously and to have a good work ethic. Work is thus understood as the key to self-sufficiency. And as Weber analysed, if work is godly, then the worker can determine their own state of grace. And this paradoxically led to the diminishment of the importance of the church. And Jameson theorised this in terms of the vanishing mediator. Work is thus presented as freedom from the humiliation of welfare. But again, we should ask why and how it became humiliating to give or to receive charity, particularly given that charity is allegedly central to the Western Christian tradition. The work ethic thus makes economic status a matter of individual achievement more than it makes it, and more than that, makes it a moral achievement. So poverty is thus equated with a lack of moral fibre. It reverses the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. Here, the child must raise himself in order to be admitted to the village. And this in turn rationalizes work itself. On this view of things, all work is good work because work is by nature morally improving. Demanding better work thus goes against the work ethic. As Weber puts it, the work ethic delivers workers to their exploitation. And this goes beyond ideology. It doesn't merely deceive subjects, rather, it actively produces subjects and subjectivities that prioritize work. So we can think of the work ethic as a kind of biopolitical force. The individual subject isn't the opposite of power, but rather an effect or product of power. And as Deleuze and Guattari always argue, capitalism produces the subjects that it needs. So the work ethic is effective because rather than simply obey it, we internalize it and embody it. The work ethic isn't just advice about how to behave, it is an instruction on who we are and who we should be. We thus cultivate habits of mind and body that strive towards the work ethic's ideal way of being. If we don't work hard enough or don't achieve enough, we feel guilty and self-reproach, and this is a manifestation of the work ethic. The work ethic is not without its paradoxes. On the one hand, work is promoted and held up as the key to personal liberty and independence, while on the other hand, work is fundamentally hierarchical, requiring our submission to a regime of power, command, and control. And this is perhaps the central paradox or contradiction of 21st century life. We must submit to power in order to be free. Our subjectivity is thus always a kind of subjection, and our failure to see this can be understood in Marxist terms as a false consciousness. If we are what we do, then changes in the nature of work itself have huge social and cultural implications, which is why cultural studies really needs to pay attention to work.